Hello, welcome to Unit 5, Lesson 4, Money and Debts. The learning objective for this lesson is you will be able to understand what positive and negative numbers mean in a situation involving money. So, just like we've talked about with elevation and temperature, those both can have negative connotations. Money also can have a negative connotation. And there is quite a lot of vocabulary that goes along with this. So as we're going through this, make sure when I give you a new vocabulary word that you're taking the time to write it down and really understand what we're meaning, because this applies to the real world. You need to know what these words mean, because once you have your own checking accounts or savings account, or you may even have those now, it's important to understand what these terms are in relation to money. Now, for this lesson, because obviously we don't have enough time to cover everything, we're going to skip the first activity and go to the second activity. So, the first activity has to do with cafeteria food debt. Now, some of you may or may not realize this, but this kind of applies to you, maybe not this year because I don't think anyone pays for lunch right now, but maybe in the future or in the past you've had to pay for lunch and you use something called push coin to pay for your food, and then they scan your card and they take money out of your account. So you guys all have a cafeteria account. Now, what happens when you overdraw is important because although they do give you some leeway if it happens once, but eventually if you continue to overdraw, the cafeteria will not let you buy any more food. So this really applies to something that you guys kind of deal with on a daily basis. So the problem says at the beginning of the month, Kieran had $24 in the school cafeteria account. Use a variable to represent the unknown quantity in each transaction. So that's important. The first thing it says, use a variable to represent an unknown quantity. So we need to be using X, Y, P, C, whatever variable you want, but I need to see a variable in each situation. So that's the first important thing. And then it says to write an equation to represent it. So I should also see an equation, which means seeing equal signs. So you need to make sure you have a variable and you have an equation that uses that variable. Then it says to represent each transaction on a number line. We're not going to worry about this step right here. We're going to kind of skip that. We don't need the number line at this point. Let's focus on what we know about solving these problems. But you do need to answer what is the unknown quantity in each case. So let's look at question 1. It says, in the first week, he spent $16 on lunches. How much was in the account then? So we have to go back to the original blurb that tells us about this problem. And it says, Kieran has $24 in his high school cafeteria account. So we have $24. This is his starting amount. It's the amount that got put into his account. So because it's getting put in, that is being put in, that is a positive amount. Now, just so you know, the vocab word that goes along with putting something into an account is called a deposit. So they deposited $24 into his account, and anytime you deposit something, that is a positive connotation, okay? So if he spent $16 on lunches in the first week, spent is a negative connotation. So because you're taking the money out, right? This is with a withdrawal, right? Whenever you take money out of an account, you're withdrawing it, and that has a negative connotation. So again, deposit is a positive connotation. So let's write the word positive next to it. And withdrawal is a negative connotation. Okay, so keep that in mind whenever you hear those words. So think of when you're writing equations, you need to think of your story and write the equation to match the story. So in our story, Kieran deposited $24 in his account. So that's a positive 24. Then he said he withdrawed $16. So although I know some of you are going to want to write it as minus 16, which technically is not wrong, I really want to see you guys writing it as plus negative 16 for now. Because of what we're dealing with negatives, I want you to recognize that this is a negative connotation. So 24 minus 16, I still need that variable in the equation part, so it's going to be equal to x. Doesn't matter what variable you use, I'm just using x. So make sure you have that equation part and the variable part. So to solve this, I just use what I know about adding integers. The signs are opposite, so I know I'm going to subtract these absolute values. So if I want to do some margin work, that's fine. 24 minus 16 is 8. And then I know that because there are more positives, that this is going to be a positive 8. So therefore, how much was in his account? We know there was $8 in his account. So after the first week, he now is at $8. Question 2, then he deposited, there's that deposited word again, remember, that's a positive connotation. So let's write the word positive next to it. So it says he deposited some more money in, and his account balance was $28. So it doesn't say that that he deposited $28. It says that it equals $28 after he deposits some unknown amount. So again, let's think of our story. Our story starts off with after he spent the $16, he now has $8 in his account. So I start with my 8. Okay, plus some unknown amount. I don't know what some unknown amount is, so I'm just going to again use a variable. This time I'll use y. But I do know that it equals 28. So there's a couple of ways you can go about solving this. If you want to practice one-step equations, to solve this, we would subtract 8 from both sides. And we see that y equals 20. You can also just reason it out. What plus 8 will give you 28? Well, we know that's going to be $20. So he deposited $20 in his account. All right, so now he has $20 or $28 in his account. So let's keep going from there. He then spent $34 on lunches the next week. How much was in his account then? So spent $34, that's kind of like withdrawing, right? Because that's coming out of his account. So again, that's a negative connotation. So if he was at $28 and he spent $34, my equation is now going to be 28 plus negative 34, and I'm going to say P this time, equals P. So signs are different. I know I have to subtract the absolute values. So I'm going to do 34 minus 28, which equals 6. So P is equal to 6, but I need to decide if it's negative or positive. So there are more negatives in this case. So P equals negative 6. So that tells us he has negative $6 in his account. Now, wait a second. You might say, well, that's not possible. You can't have a negative amount in a bank account. And yeah, that's kind of correct, right? Negative money is not physical. You can't hold it. It's one of those kind of abstract things. But it is possible to have a negative amount in any kind of account. When this happened, this is called debt. Okay, so this means you owe money. You owe money. Okay, so whenever you're dealing with negative money, just note that that vocab term is called debt. So now, Kieran is at negative $6 in his account. It says that he then deposited enough money to pay off his debt to the cafeteria. How much did he deposit? So if he's paying off his debt, that means he wants to reach a point where it has $0. So we need to get to $0. So we set up our equation. He currently has negative $6. He adds some unknown amount. I'm going to call it D. And he ends up at 0. So what plus negative 6 will give you 0? Well, hopefully you recognize the additive inverse that we talked about last lesson. And note that anytime you add opposites, it equals 0. So therefore, D must equal positive 6. So we know he deposited $6 in his account. Okay. Question 5 says, explain why it makes sense to use negative number to represent Kieran's account balance when he owes money. So the reason why we use a negative number to represent an account balance when someone owes money, it's so that we know that it's money that he doesn't actually have. So it represents that he doesn't actually have the money. Okay, it's something that has to be paid back. So we need to somehow represent that you owe some money. So we do that through negative numbers. So it tells us we are in debt. So just want to review some things that we've been talking about for several days when it comes to adding integers. When you're adding signs of our numbers with opposite signs, note that you're subtracting the absolute values and taking the sign of the bigger number. Also note that when you add opposites, it always equals zeros. And we didn't really talk about it in this case. Note that when you add numbers of the same sign, you add the absolute values and then just take that sign. All right, let's move on to the next activity, lesson 4.3. So in this activity, we're looking at a bank statement. So when you go home tonight, go ahead and ask your parents to show you a most recent checking account statement so you can kind of see what it looks like at your parents' bank. But this is an example of what it might look like. Some things that you may notice is that it gives you the date here. It tells you where, what it was spent on. Sometimes it's not very specific. It just gives you like maybe where you spent it or if you deposited a check, things like that. Here you have the withdrawals column. So remember, this is taking money out. Here you have the deposit column, which is putting money in. And then you have your balance column, which just basically tells you how much money do you currently have in your checking account based on any withdrawals or deposits you've made. Okay, so let's look at question 1. It says if you put withdrawals and deposits in the same column, how can they be represented? So right now, they're in separate columns and they show up as all positive numbers. But if we had them all just in one column, each number stacked on top, it wouldn't make sense for them to all be positives. So instead, we would use negatives to represent the withdrawals. So this way, when they all line up, you can see anything that's a withdrawal will be a negative number. Anything that's a deposit would be a positive number. Question 2 says, Andre withdraws $40 to buy a music player. What is his new balance? So we have to take a look at his current balance. His current balance is negative $62.40. So that's where we're currently at. So I'm going to write that down. And then he withdraws $40. So remember, withdrawal is a negative connotation. So that tells me this is going to be a negative 40. So I'm going to do negative 62.47 plus negative 40. So the signs are the same. So I know I'm going to have to add those absolute values. So I'm going to do some margin work. So I'm going to do 62.47 plus $40. Add them up, 7, 4, 2, 10. So I know when I add the absolute values, I end up at $102.47. But I have to remember these are all negative numbers, so that tells me this should be a negative value. So his new balance is negative $102.47. Question 3 says, if Andre deposits $100 in his account, will he still be in debt? And how do you know? Well, there's a couple of ways you can think about this. So if we think about if he's currently at $102.47 and he deposits $100, that's adding $100 to his balance. So if I add 100, will I end up in the positive area? And looking at this, I won't. I don't have enough positives to get over to the positive section of the number line. There are more negatives than positives in this case. So I know that I will not end up being in the positive section, so he will still be in debt. You can also go ahead and solve this. So the signs are different, so I'm going to subtract. So 102.47 minus 100. Well, that's 2.47, but because, again, there are more negatives, he's going to be still in the negative section. So, yes, he will still be in debt. If you wanted to think about it a step further, you can even ask yourself, well, how much more will he have to deposit in order to no longer be in debt? And that answer is he would need to deposit an additional $2.47. So some key ideas here. Just remember, we can use positive numbers to represent payments in bank accounts. So just remember, when you put money into an account, it's called a deposit. When you take money out of an account, it's called a withdrawal. And also remember that when you are in debt, this means you have a negative amount or that you owe someone money. Someone or a bank money. Okay, also remember you can use the additive inverse to quickly find out how much money is needed to reach a balance of 0. So in the previous problem, Andre was still in debt for $2.47. So in order to reach a 0 balance, he would have to add in an additional an additional amount of $2.47. So that's it for this lesson. Remember, you need to take a picture of the notes in Notability. Make sure those pictures are the size of your iPad screen so I can read everything you have copied down. Submit it, and then you'll receive your participation points for the day. Thanks for watching.